Last season, I harvested just over 200 onions from a raised bed that measured 4 feet by 8 feet. That is 32 square feet. The year before, using the same bed with conventional single-row spacing, I got about 90. Same varieties, same soil, same amount of water. The only thing I changed was how I arranged them in the ground. For most of my gardening life, I planted onions the way every book tells you to. One row, 4 to 6 inches apart, 12 inches between rows. It works fine if you have unlimited space, but if you are like most backyard gardeners, space is the one thing you never have enough of. And I kept looking at all that bare soil between my onion rows thinking, there has to be a better way. Turns out there is, and it has been sitting right in front of me for years. About 5 seasons ago, I was spending time around a small Amish settlement outside of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and I walked past a kitchen garden that stopped me in my tracks. Tawisium onion patch was maybe half the size of mine, but it was packed. Onions everywhere, green tops standing shoulder to shoulder, and every single plant looked healthy and vigorous. I asked the woman tending it how she got that many onions into that space, and she looked at me like I had asked how water works. She said, "We just plant them close. We always have. Today I am going to walk you through exactly how the Amish plant onions to double their harvest in half the space. From bed preparation to planting geometry to the specific varieties that handle tight spacing without rotting or stunting." And stay with me to the end because I will share a simple Amish technique for curing and storing onions that can keep them sound for 6 months or longer without any refrigeration. I have never seen it explained properly in any modern gardening guide. Now, I want to be honest about something. I taught science for 30 years. I consider myself a fairly methodical gardener. And yet I spent over 2 decades planting onions the same way without ever questioning the spacing. Not once. I just followed what the seed packet said and assumed that was the best approach. If you have been doing the same thing, you are in good company. I was right there with you, leaving half my bed empty because a label told me to. Then I spent time around those Amish gardens and realized they were not following the same rules, not because they were being rebellious, but because the rules I was following were designed for mechanized agriculture, for tractors and cultivators that need room to pass between rows. The Amish do not have that constraint. They work by hand, and they have been refining their hand methods for generations. Here is the cultural context that makes this click. Amish families are large, 8, 10, sometimes 12 people sitting down to dinner every night. And most Amish households grow the majority of their own food on relatively modest plots. They do not have the luxury of wasting space. Every square foot of garden has to produce as much as it possibly can because that food has to last through winter. That is not a philosophy. That is a math problem. There is a practical principle behind how they approach the garden. You work with what you have and you waste nothing. Not space, not seed, not time. When you understand that their methods come from genuine necessity, from needing to feed a big family from a small piece of ground, their techniques make perfect sense. They are not tricks. They are solutions that evolved over 300 years of growing food under real pressure. That understanding is what changed how I think about spacing, not just for onions, but for everything in the garden. So let me show you how to set this up from the ground level. The first thing you need to get right is your soil, because tight spacing only works if every plant has enough nutrition in the inches immediately surrounding it. When you double the number of onions in a bed, you are doubling the demand on that soil. Skip this part, and you will end up with twice as many undersized bulbs, which is worse than what you started with. Here's what to do. 4 to 6 weeks before your planting date, spread 3 inches of well-aged compost across your bed and work it into the top 6 to 8 inches of soil. If you can add a half-inch layer of composted manure on top of that, even better. The Amish I have watched almost always use a blend of horse manure compost and kitchen scraps compost that has been aging over winter. That combination gives you a soil that is loose, moisture retentive, and loaded with the slow-release nutrients onions need. Now, onions are heavy feeders, especially for phosphorus and potassium. If you have access to bone meal, work in about 2 cups per 32 square feet of bed at the same time you add your compost. Bone meal breaks down slowly and provides phosphorus right in the root zone where developing bulbs need it most. If you do not have bone meal, a balanced organic granular fertilizer at the rate listed on the bag works fine. The reason this matters is biology. Onions have shallow, sparse root systems. They cannot forage far for nutrients. When you plant them close together, their roots overlap quickly, and if the soil is not rich enough, they compete instead of coexist. Rich, well-amended soil is what makes tight spacing possible instead of counterproductive. One important note: if you're in zones 3 through 5, get your compost and amendments down as early as the ground is workable, ideally late March or early April, so the soil microbes have time to activate before you plant. In zones 7 through 9, you can do this in late January or February. Now here is where things start looking different from a conventional garden, and this is the heart of the whole method. Instead of planting in single rows with wide gaps between them, the Amish plant onions in a tight grid pattern across the entire surface of the bed. Think of it like a checkerboard where every square has an onion in it. Here is the exact geometry. Space your onions 5 inches apart in every direction, center to center. Not 5 inches between rows with different spacing within the row. 5 inches uniformly in a staggered grid. What that means is each row is offset by about 2.5 inches from the row next to it, so the onions nest into the gaps. Picture how bricks are laid in a wall, where each brick sits over the joint of the two below it. That is the pattern. In a 4 by 8 foot bed, this staggered grid gives you roughly 200 planting spots. A conventional layout in the same bed with rows 12 inches apart and plants 4 inches apart within each row gives you about 80. That is the math behind the claim in the title, and it is real. Now, I want to be straight with you. 5-inch spacing is tight. Most extension service guides will tell you 6 inches minimum. But here is what the Amish figured out through generations of growing and what research from Cornell and Oregon State has since supported. Onions planted at 4 to 5 inch spacing in highly fertile soil produce bulbs that are slightly smaller individually but dramatically higher in total yield per square foot. You get more pounds of onions from the same bed. The individual bulbs are medium-sized rather than jumbo, which for cooking is actually more practical anyway. The key is not to go tighter than 4.5 inches. Below that threshold, air circulation drops enough that fungal problems increase, especially in humid climates. 5 inches is the sweet spot that the Amish gardeners I have learned from consistently use. To plant, use a dibber or even just a thick dowel to poke holes about 1 inch deep at each grid point. Drop in your onion set or transplant, firm the soil gently around it, and move on. If you're planting from sets, point the tip up. If you are using transplants, bury them just to the depth of the white base. Do not bury the green tops. One thing that makes or breaks this method is variety selection, and this is where I made my biggest mistake the first year I tried dense planting. I used a storage variety called copra, which produces large bulbs. In tight spacing, those big-bulbed varieties push against each other as they size up, and you end up with misshapen onions and increased rot where the skins press together. The Amish families I have worked with choose medium-bulbing varieties for dense planting. The ones I have had the best results with are Stuttgarter, which is a classic yellow storage onion that naturally produces a medium-sized, flattened bulb, and Red Wing, which is a beautiful, deep red variety that also stays in the medium range. For white onions, White Ebenezer performs well in tight spacing. Avoid large globe types like Walla Walla, Ailsa Craig, or any variety described as jumbo or colossal on the label. These need the wider spacing to develop properly, and forcing them into a grid pattern just creates problems. If you are in zones 3 through 5, stick with long day varieties. Stuttgarter and Copra are both long day types, but remember, Copra bulbs too large for this method. In zones 7 through 9, choose intermediate or short day varieties. Texas Early Grana and Red Creole are good short day options that stay medium-sized. If you have been following along and this approach is making sense, do me a favor and hit subscribe. I have a lot more of these deep dives coming into traditional growing methods that most modern guides skip right over. All right, let us keep going. Now, here is where most people run into trouble with dense planting, and it is the one thing that separates a productive tight bed from a moldy disaster: watering. When onions are planted this close together, you lose the air gaps between rows that help soil dry out between waterings. That means your watering schedule needs to change. The Amish approach is to water deeply but less frequently and always at the soil level, never overhead. Here is the practical method. Water your onion bed about 1 inch per week during the growing season. Use a soaker hose or drip irrigation laid in a serpentine pattern across the bed, roughly 5 to 6 inches apart, so every onion is within a few inches of a water source. Water once or twice a week depending on rainfall, and let the top inch of soil dry between sessions. Push your finger into the soil. If the top inch is dry but it is moist below, you are in the right range. The reason overhead watering is a problem in dense plantings is that the leaf canopy traps moisture against the necks of the onions, which is exactly where fungal diseases like botrytis neck rot get started. The Amish gardeners I have observed water exclusively at soil level for onions, and they are very deliberate about it. They would rather underwater slightly than overwater, because a dry onion patch produces smaller bulbs, but a wet onion patch produces rotten ones. In zones 8 and 9, where summers are hot and humidity is high, this is especially critical. Consider adding a thin layer of straw mulch, about 1 to 2 inches, between the onions after they are established. This keeps the soil cooler, retains moisture, and reduces the need for frequent watering. In cooler zones, skip the heavy mulch, since onions actually benefit from warm soil to size up properly. This next part is one that I completely missed for years, and it is something the Amish do as naturally as breathing. About 3 to 4 weeks before harvest, which in most areas is mid to late July for spring planted onions, you need to stop watering entirely and stop all fertilizing. Here is why this matters. When an onion begins to mature, the neck where the green top meets the bulb starts to soften and dry down. If you keep watering through this stage, the neck stays thick and moist, which dramatically shortens how long the onion will last in storage. Worse, it creates an open invitation for neck rot. The visual cue you are watching for is this: when roughly half the tops in your bed have fallen over and started to yellow, that is the signal that the bulbs are finishing. Stop watering immediately. Let them sit in dry soil for another 1 to 2 weeks. The outer skins will start to feel papery and dry to the touch. That is exactly what you want. The conventional approach is to keep watering right up until harvest, and then try to cure the onions afterward. The Amish approach is to begin the curing process while the onions are still in the ground. By the time they pull them, those bulbs already have a head start on developing the tight, dry outer skins that protect them in long-term storage. The difference in storage life is dramatic, and I will share exactly how they handle the rest of the curing process in the bonus tip at the end. Now let me walk through a few patterns I see. Gardeners repeat year after year that the Amish approach handles differently. No judgment here. I did every one of these myself. The first pattern is spacing onions based on the seed packet without considering bed type. Most spacing recommendations assume row agriculture with paths between rows. If you are growing in a raised bed or intensive bed where you do not walk between rows, those wide spacing guidelines waste an enormous amount of productive ground. The Amish plant for the bed, not for the tractor. The second pattern is choosing varieties based on flavor alone without thinking about growth habit. I love the taste of a big sweet Vidalia, but planting a jumbo variety in a tight grid just does not work. The Amish choose varieties that fit the method. They pick medium bulbing types for dense beds and save the large varieties for rows where they have room to spread. It is a practical decision, not a flavor compromise. Medium onions taste just as good. The third pattern is watering onions the same way you water everything else. Onions have different moisture needs at different growth stages, and dense plantings amplify those needs. Most of us set up one watering schedule for the whole garden and leave it alone. The Amish treat the onion patch as its own zone, with its own rhythm. Late-season water reduction is especially important and is the step most conventional gardeners skip entirely. The fourth pattern is harvesting and immediately storing without proper curing. This is the biggest storage killer, and it connects directly to the bonus tip I promised you at the beginning. Here is that technique, and it is one I learned from an Amish neighbor named Eli, who has been growing onions this way for longer than I have been gardening. When Eli harvests his onions, he does not bring them inside right away. He lays them out in a single layer on a raised wooden screen, which is basically a frame of 2x4s with hardware cloth stretched across it set up on sawhorses in a covered but well-ventilated area. His is under a lean-to roof on the north side of his barn, where they get air circulation but no direct afternoon sun. He leaves them there for 2 to 3 weeks. That is longer than most guides suggest. During that time, the tops dry completely, the outer 2 to 3 layers of skin tighten and become papery, and the necks shrink and seal. He told me the neck is the door. If you close it all the way, nothing gets in. After 2 to 3 weeks of curing, he clips the dried tops to about 1 inch above the bulb, brushes off any loose soil with his hand, never washes them, and stores them in mesh bags or shallow wooden crates in a cool, dark area of his basement. He says his onions regularly last 5 to 6 months stored this way, sometimes longer. The key details that make this work are the raised screen for airflow underneath, the shaded but open air location, and the patience to cure for the full 2 to 3 weeks. I tried this method 3 seasons ago after years of losing onions to soft spots and mold within a month or 2 of harvest. That first year, using Eli's curing method, I had onions in good condition all the way into February. It was a revelation. If you do not have a lean-to or barn, you can build a simple curing screen from a few pieces of scrap lumber and a section of hardware cloth. Set it up in your garage with the door cracked for ventilation or under a porch overhang. The 2 things you need are airflow on all sides, including underneath, and protection from direct sun and rain. That is the complete system I learned from Amish gardeners for growing twice as many onions in the same amount of space. Amend your soil deeply and richly because dense planting demands it. Use a staggered 5-inch grid instead of conventional rows. Choose medium bulbing varieties that suit tight spacing. Water at soil level and less frequently than you think. Stop all water 3 to 4 weeks before harvest to start the curing process in the ground. And finish with a proper 2 to 3 week air cure before storage. If you tried any of this, or if you have your own high-density planting methods, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what varieties work in your zone, what spacing you have tested, what surprised you, and if you want more of these deep dives into traditional growing methods from communities that have been feeding large families from small gardens for centuries, hit subscribe. I have a lot more of these coming. Thanks for spending time with me today. I will see you in the next one.